I wasn't in a good place that summer, and I can say that now without trying to dress it up as grit or duty or just a hard season. Back then, I still believed if a man kept moving, kept lists, kept tools where they belonged, he could outrun whatever was waiting for him in the quiet. I had spent 22 years as a utility line foreman, and that work trains you to trust sequence over feeling. Inspect, isolate, repair, restore, document. If wind snaps a line, you don't stand there arguing with weather. You put your gloves on and climb. That was the framework I knew. Then my wife died slowly enough for us both to see it coming, and quickly enough to make every promise feel unfinished. And none of my methods meant a thing in a house where a 9-year-old boy stopped sleeping through the night. Luke and I moved to my grandfather's ridge place 6 weeks after the funeral because I told myself we needed air, work, and distance from casseroles and careful voices. The homestead had sat mostly empty for years except for a cousin checking pipes in winter, so it was all weathered boards, tired fencing, and a barn that leaned like it wanted to confess something. On paper, it looked like salvation to a practical man. Debt-free land, a sound well, timber rights still intact, enough pasture for a few head if I wanted them. In practice, it was 30 miles to groceries, spotty service, and evenings that stretched wider than either of us knew what to do with. Boone came with us, old farm dog with a grey muzzle and stiff hips, loyal as a hinge. He slept by Luke's door every night like he'd assigned himself the post, and nobody was allowed to question command. By the second week of June, I had built us a routine so strict it could have passed inspection. Up at 5:30, coffee for me, oatmeal for Luke. Feed Boone, walk fence line with a hammer, and staples in a 5-gallon bucket. Clear brush from the lower drive. Split whatever wood had dried enough to split clean. Check generator fuel and choke settings. Lunch at noon whether we were hungry or not. Hardware run on Tuesdays. Laundry at the coin place in town on Thursdays, because the old washer in the mudroom shook like a tractor and quit mid-cycle half the time. I put everything on a clipboard hanging by the back door, and I made a second checklist for Luke because structure was supposed to help kids feel safe. He took that clipboard serious too, tongue tucked in the corner of his mouth while he printed little check marks in pencil. He was a good boy. Still is. The part I couldn't solve started around sundown. Light would flatten over the ridge, that dull blue-grey hour when the treetops stop shining and the hollows fill first, and Luke's shoulders would crawl up toward his ears. He never threw a fit. That would have been easier to meet. He got quiet, watched windows, asked practical questions in a voice too careful for a child. "Dad, if the power goes out, does the fridge quit right away?" "Yeah, buddy, but it holds cold for a while." "How long is a while?" "Depends how much we open it." "What if we don't open it at all?" "Then we're fine till morning most nights." He nodded like he was taking inventory. Then a minute later, "What if it's not most nights?" That question hit me in a place I didn't have language for. Not because he asked it, but because I had been asking the same thing in my own head about everything since the hospital. What if it's not most nights? What if this is the night it all comes apart and you can't put it back in order before your kid sees you fail? I told myself his fear of dark would pass. Kids cycle through things. Thunder, closets, new schools. I read articles at 2 in the morning on my phone with brightness turned low so I wouldn't wake him in the bunk room across the hall. Validate feeling without reinforcing fear. Offer coping tools. Establish consistent bedtime ritual. I tried all of it. I set a lantern by his bed. We did breathing counts. We made a joke out of checking corners for dust bunnies with criminal intent. And for 30 seconds, he laughed hard enough to snort. Then the laugh would fade, and he'd look down the hallway where the house opened into shadow, and I could feel my own chest tighten right alongside his. I was supposed to lend him steadiness. Too often I met him with impatience disguised as instruction. One night I snapped because he asked me to leave the hall light on after I'd already told him we were conserving fuel for the generator in case of storms. I didn't yell. I did that low, clipped father voice that can cut worse because it sounds controlled. Luke, we've been over this. You're safe. Boone's right there. I'm 20 feet away. You can't keep doing this every single night. His face crumpled, and he tried to hide it by looking at the blanket. I'm trying, Dad. The room got very still after that. Boone lifted his head, glanced at me, then set it back down with a sigh like an old man disappointed in young men. I sat on the edge of Luke's bed and put my hand on his hair and stared at the floorboards until they blurred. I know, I said. I know you are. I'm sorry. That was on me. He leaned into my side, all elbows and warm kid weight, and whispered, I don't like when the house gets big. That was exactly it. He gave it better words than I could. At dark, that old house got big. Rooms pulled away from each other. Every creak sounded farther than it should, and beneath his fear, there was mine. Not of monsters, not of woods, but of the way silence let memory walk in and sit down uninvited. I could hear my wife's cough in the pause between gusts some nights, or think I could, and then hate myself for listening for it again. Mornings kept me useful. Afternoons kept me tired. Dusk kept finding me. I worked harder than the place required because muscle fatigue was simpler than grief. I reset fence posts that could have lasted another year. I scraped and repainted the feed room door even though nobody but us saw it. I rehung kitchen cabinets that were already square because the old screws annoyed me. I carried things farther than needed just to feel strain in my back and forearms. Practical men know how to hide inside chores. If you saw me then, you would have called me dependable, maybe even strong. You would have been wrong about both in the ways that mattered. Town was polite but distant in the way mountain communities can be until you prove you're staying. The cashier at Miller's Feed started setting aside the dog food Boone liked without me asking. The woman at the pharmacy looked me in the eye a little too long when I picked up Luke's allergy refill, the way people do when they know your history but don't know your boundaries. I appreciated the kindness and still dreaded every errand because each one ended with the same drive home, climbing switchbacks toward a ridgeline that looked beautiful from far off and lonely up close. Every mile higher, my signal bars dropped, and the world narrowed to engine noise and the next curve. The weather started its own pattern by late June. Locals called it the Black Ridge outages with half a shrug, like bad storms were just another neighbor you tolerated. Afternoon heat built heavy and metallic, then storms rolled in hard off the west shoulder, quick lightning, hard rain, wind that pushed under eaves and made doors breathe on their hinges. Power blinked often and failed long enough to matter twice that first month. I handled the mechanical part fine. Rain jacket on, headlamp tight, sprint to the shed, pull cord, switch transfer, lights back if the generator cooperated. The emotional part was a different job. Each time the house went black, Luke folded inward like someone had pulled a string from his spine. Even with Boone pressing against his leg and me talking steady, his breathing went shallow and fast. I watched my son brace against darkness like it was a physical force, and I couldn't convince either of us that night was ordinary anymore. One evening after the third outage, rain still ticking off the porch roof, and the generator finally humming clean, Luke sat at the kitchen table drawing by lantern light. He was sketching the barn with a pencil nub worn down to his fingers, adding every board seam like accuracy could make a place behave. He didn't look up when he spoke. Did Mom get scared of dark when she was sick? I set 2 mugs on the table. Cocoa for him, reheated coffee for me, gone bitter from the burner. No, I said, then corrected myself because he deserved truth. Maybe sometimes. She got scared of pain more than dark. He nodded and shaded the barn roof slower. I get scared of both. That one almost dropped me. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat, hands around a mug I didn't want, and told him, "You can be scared and still be brave. Those can happen together." It sounded like a line from a poster in a school hallway, thin and finished at the edges, but he accepted it with that serious little nod and took a drink. Then he pushed his paper toward me. In the bottom corner, he had drawn Boone bigger than life, chest out, guarding the front steps like a soldier. Behind the dog, he'd drawn the woods as a dark wall, but he'd left one narrow strip unshaded between 2 pines, like a path or a seam. "Can we keep the porch light on tonight?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Tonight we can." After he went to bed, I stood alone at the sink and watched the reflection of that porch bulb tremble in the black window while moths battered themselves dumb against the glass. I remember thinking that, if competence were enough, we'd already be fine. We had food in the pantry, dry socks in drawers, fuel in cans, tools in order, a dog at the door, and a roof that held. Yet the house still felt like a place we were borrowing from our own lives, waiting to be told we didn't belong in it. I wasn't afraid of work. I was afraid that grief had made me smaller, and my son could feel it. I slept light that whole season. Any shift in Boone's breathing woke me. Any wind gust that changed pitch against the ridge woke me. Sometime near 2 most nights, I'd walk the hallway without turning on lights, stop outside Luke's room, and listen to him breathe. If it was steady, I could go back to bed. If it hitched, I sat on the floor by his door until it settled. That was where I admitted things I wouldn't say in daylight. I missed my wife in plain, ordinary ways that hurt worse than anniversaries. I missed being witnessed. I missed handing off worry for 10 minutes to someone who knew the same child I knew. Mostly I missed the version of myself that believed effort always paid out in proportion. On the last dry evening before the next run of storms, Luke and I ate on the porch because the kitchen stayed hot long after sunset. Beans, cornbread, sliced tomatoes with too much salt. Boone lay stretched across the top step, one ear flicking at flies, and the valley below us turned slowly from green to smoke blue. Luke asked if stars came out faster on ridges. I told him I didn't know, but it felt that way. We sat quiet for a while, forks scraping plates, and for once, silence didn't press on us. Then he leaned against my shoulder and said, "I think I can do tonight better." I looked out at the tree line and answered, "Me too, buddy." Not because I believed it fully, but because I wanted to practice believing in front of him until it got real. Luke finished eating, scraped his plate clean with a square of cornbread, and carried both dishes inside without being asked. That was his mother in him, quiet competence where nobody clapped for it. I watched him stand on a stool at the sink, sleeves pushed up, serious as a bookkeeper while he rinsed tomato seeds from ceramic. Boone thumped his tail twice when Luke passed, then settled back down with his chin on his paws, facing the yard like he had his own shift to run. By the time the dishes were drying in the rack and the sky had gone from blue to ink at the edges, Luke was fighting yawns he didn't want to admit. I walked him to his room, checked under the bed because ritual mattered more than logic at that hour, and left his lamp on low. "You want the door open or mostly open?" I asked. "Mostly," he said, measuring with his fingers. "Like this much." "Done." He studied me a second, then asked, "You gonna stay up?" "Yeah, just a while." He nodded, climbed under the blanket, and reached down to scratch Boone's ear. "Night, old man." Boone made a soft grunt like he accepted the title. I stood there until Luke's breathing stretched out into that even pattern kids get when sleep wins, despite their best arguments, then eased the door to mostly open and stepped back into the hall. The house sounded bigger after 9 o'clock. Not louder, just spread out. A joist clicked on the west wall. Wind pushed once under the eaves and moved on. The refrigerator compressor kicked in and off like a machine remembering its own age. I poured the last of the coffee, drank half of it cold, and carried the mug outside. The porch boards held a little warmth from the day. Beyond the rail, the pasture sloped down into darker grass, and then trees, black shapes layered against a thinner black sky. One porch bulb burned over my shoulder, drawing moths in crooked circles. Their wings made that dry paper sound when they hit the glass. Boone came and sat by my boot, not leaning, not asking, just present. I stayed there and did the thing I had been avoiding in daylight, which was nothing. No hammer in my hand, no list, no repair that made sense when finished. Just sitting with my elbows on my knees and looking into country dark until my eyes adjusted to depth. I could pick out the fence line by memory more than sight, the old cedar post at the lower bend, the gap where I still needed to hang a fresh gate. Practical details floated through first, then thinned. Under them was the familiar ache, not sharp anymore, but heavy, like carrying wet canvas. When grief hit me back then, it wasn't dramatic. It was domestic. I'd think about how she used to fold Luke's socks into pairs so exact it looked like store packaging. How she'd hum in the pantry when she couldn't find cumin. How she could settle Luke after a nightmare in 90 seconds with one hand on his chest and 2 sentences. I had her recipe card for chicken stew in the kitchen drawer and still burned the onions every third try. There are kinds of missing that make you cry, and kinds that make you stare at a fence post for 5 minutes because your brain forgot what came next. I remember sitting there and thinking, plain as a bolt laid on a workbench, I can keep this place standing, but I don't know if I can make it feel like home for him. That admission felt like dropping a tool in deep water and hearing no splash. Around 10, I did a full walk of the yard with a flashlight because routine gave my hands something to do. I checked the truck doors, the propane valve, the latch on the chicken coop we weren't using yet, and the generator shed padlock. The beam caught wet shine on old nails and spider silk between porch posts. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. Boone followed halfway, then peeled off, and stood near the tree line at the north edge of the yard, ears up but body loose, as if someone he expected was late for supper. "Boone," I said quietly, tapping my thigh. "Come on." He looked back at me, tail level, then returned on his own slow terms. Not stubborn, just thoughtful. I laughed once under my breath because arguing with a 12-year-old farm dog felt like debating county policy with a fence. You could do it, but nobody changed position. Clouds rolled in near midnight. I smelled rain before I heard it, that cool mineral scent lifting off dry dirt. I went in, checked Luke one more time, and lay down in my room with the window cracked. Wind moved through the screen in soft pulses. My body was tired and my mind was busy. The old mismatch. Sometime deep in the night, thunder crossed the ridge in long grumbles instead of sharp cracks, and rain came steady after it. I got up once to make sure the porch windows were latched and saw Boone asleep in the hallway, paws twitching through some dream where his hips didn't hurt. I stood there in the dark and listened to 2 kinds of breathing, dog and child, and let that be enough until I could sleep again. Morning came washed and silver. The storm had moved east, leaving drops hanging on the wire fence like tiny fuses. Luke ate toast in his socks and asked if we could postpone math because the numbers feel slippery when it rains. I said we could, mostly because I agreed with him and had no scientific defense for that. By the second week of July, we had both learned to work around weather the way some families work around moods. After breakfast, I sent him to sort nails by size at the mudroom bench, which he liked because it made him feel official, and I pulled on boots to assess storm mess. Boone trotted ahead, gait stiff at first, then smoother once he warmed up. The yard was muddy but intact. No branches on the truck, no new leaks at the barn roof seam. I circled to the woodpile expecting bad news because we had covered it in a hurry the day before. What I found stopped me long enough for rainwater to drip off my hat brim onto my nose. On the top step of the porch, tucked against the wall where wind couldn't reach, sat 3 neat bundles of dry kindling. Not half dry, not damp at the ends. Bone dry, split thin and even, tied with braided grass in loops so clean they looked practiced. I squatted and touched one, warm from the morning air, rough cedar and pine, cut lengths ideal for catching a fire from one match. I stood up and looked around the yard again like the wider view might explain the close one. No truck tracks except mine from yesterday. No boot prints besides the ones I was making right then. Mud held marks everywhere from rain impact and Boone's paws, yet the steps themselves were clean except for a single broad impression in the soft patch beside the bottom board. Bare. 5 blunt toe marks, wider than my spread hand by a good margin. I did what any reasonable, skeptical, practical man would do. I stared at it, then looked over my shoulder toward the kitchen window to make sure Luke wasn't watching me have a full conversation with dirt. Boone came up, sniffed the bundles once, then sat. Not alert, not tense. He had the calm expression he wore when Luke handed him a carrot top and asked him to pretend it was steak. I looked from the dog to the kindling, to the footprint, and felt my brain trying to sort columns that didn't share units. Neighbour playing jokes, I muttered, or a drifter with manners, or Roy's hired hand. Boone blinked slowly. Helpful woodland handyman with no shoes, I added, and that sounded ridiculous enough to make me snort. I carried the bundles into the mudroom, set them on a shelf above the boots, and told myself I was preserving dry fuel, not evidence. Then I went back outside with my phone and took 4 pictures anyway. Footprint with tape measure, bundles on step, close-up of grass braid, wide shot of yard showing no tracks. Old habits from outage reports die hard. Document first, decide later. Luke pushed the screen door open and came onto the porch, rubbing sleep from one eye, though he'd been up an hour. "What's that smell?" "Kindling," I said. "Good kindling." He stepped closer, saw the empty spot where bundles had been, and frowned at the grass fibres left behind. "Did you make those ties?" "No." "Who did?" I kept my voice easy. "Don't know yet." He looked toward the tree line, then back to me. Boone wasn't barking. "Nope." He accepted that with the same solemn nod he gave math facts, as if he had filed a meaningful data point. Then he said, "Can we use it tonight?" "Yeah, we can." Rain started again around noon, lighter this time, and we stayed inside doing quiet chores while water stitched down the windows. I split the first bundle in half and loaded the stove just to test burn quality. It lit fast, clean flame, little smoke, no hiss. Whoever put it there knew wood. By late afternoon, the clouds lifted enough to show strips of pale sky over the west ridge. I took the second bundle to the covered rack by the back door, then hesitated and moved it to a higher shelf where Splash couldn't reach. That small protective gesture told on me more than any confession. I already treated the gift like something that mattered. After supper, I walked to the north fence with Boone and stood where he'd paused the night before. The woods were still in a way I hadn't learned yet. Not empty, attentive. No squirrel chatter, no jay complaints, just wind moving through fir needles in long, soft passes. Boone watched between two trunks, tail low and relaxed, then sat and huffed once through his nose as if acknowledging someone across a room. I didn't see anything. Not a shape, not movement, not eyeshine. Just trees and the dim corridor between them where dusk settled first. But the back of my neck prickled with awareness that did not feel like danger, more like being observed by a patient intelligence waiting to see what kind of man you were when nobody scored your answers. I cleared my throat, felt foolish, and said into the trees, "Whoever you are, appreciate the wood." The words landed and disappeared into needles and bark. Boone got to his feet, gave the woods one last steady look, and turned for the house. I followed him, carrying a bundle under one arm, trying not to hurry, trying not to pretend I hadn't just thanked an empty stretch of mountain like it had handed me a cup of sugar. I nudged the screen door open with my shoulder, set the bundle on the counter, and found Luke at the table with his math workbook upside down, pretending he'd meant to do that. He looked from my face to the wood, reading me in that careful way kids do when they've had to learn weather from one parent. "Did you really say thank you?" he asked. I hung my jacket, buying half a second. "Yeah." "To nobody?" I pulled a match from the stove box and struck it against the side. "To whoever tied grass better than I can." That got the corner of his mouth. "Your knots are bad." "My knots are honest, different category." We built a small fire from the gifted kindling, and it caught so fast it felt almost rude to the damp oak I'd been fighting all month. Clean flame, bright and steady. Luke sat on the braided rug with Boone's head in his lap and watched the stove window like it was a television. I stayed in the rocker and listened to the house settle around us without that old pressure in my chest. Grief didn't leave. It shifted one chair over. The next morning I went back to the step before coffee, maybe hoping for another bundle, maybe hoping for nothing at all, so I could file the whole thing under odd, but solved. No wood waited there. What I found instead was 3 small stones stacked on the post at the top of the north path. One flat, one wedge, one flat again, pointed toward the generator shed like an arrowhead. Not decorative, deliberate. We'd had enough rain that the usual shortcut across the yard was slick clay by then, and the higher line along the post row stayed firm. I stood there with my mug cooling in my hand, feeling that same quiet attention I'd felt at the trees. I walked the route the stones indicated and saw where runoff had undercut a shallow trench by the low spot near the lilac bush. In daylight, it was obvious. In storm dark, with a headlamp and hurry, it was a twisted ankle waiting for me. I fetched 2 scrap boards and bridged it before breakfast. Practical solution, immediate benefit. Still, while I hammered, I kept glancing at the post like it might explain itself if I stared long enough. Luke came out in boots too big for him, carrying the pencil clipboard against his chest. "You changing the path?" "Yep." "Because of those rocks?" I drove a nail and straightened. "Because the ground dropped there." He nodded, then added, "The rocks noticed first." There wasn't a good adult answer to that. I told him to hold the board level, and we finished the bridge together. By the following Tuesday, the black ridge pattern settled into something mean and predictable. Heat all day, bruised clouds by 4, wind shift at supper, then lightning somewhere close enough to count without trying. I checked fuel every afternoon, moved extension cords higher, and kept flashlights lined on the counter like surgical tools. Luke still tensed at sunset, but the edge had changed. He started asking if we could sit on the porch before full dark so he could listen for normal stuff. Normal stuff meant tree frogs, distant creek, Boone's tags when he shook, the metal tick of the cooling truck hood. He was building a map of safe sounds, and I let him lead. One evening, Boone trotted ahead to the north fence, stopped at the same stand of fur, and sat with his tail thumping once against the grass. No bark, no raised hackles, no warning rumble. He looked into the trees, then back at Luke, then into the trees again, like introducing two neighbors who hadn't met. Luke stood with one hand in my back pocket, not hiding exactly, just anchored. "You see anything?" he whispered. "Not yet. Do you feel weird?" I considered that. Not bad weird. Me neither. The birds had gone quiet again, all at once but not in panic. It was the kind of hush that arrives in church before music starts. Everybody present, nobody afraid. Wind moved high in the fir tops. Somewhere uphill, something large shifted weight through brush, with a careful, measured cadence I'd never heard from deer. Branches flexed. Then stillness came back, patient as ever. That night, after Luke slept, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone and built a folder I named Ridge Notes, like I was writing outage reports for a foreman who happened to be me. Photo 1. Wide print beside the porch step with tape measure. Photo 2. Grass-tied kindling close up. Photo 3. Stacked stones on north post. I added date, time, weather, and a plain description for each. I told myself this was skepticism, not belief. Documentation is what you do when you don't trust your own interpretation. Still, I caught myself enlarging the print photo until pixels broke apart, tracing each toe mark with my thumb as if a sharper image might hand me certainty. 2 days later, I found a rusted snare wire by the lower fence where the old line met state timber. I'd never set snares there, and neither had my grandfather by the look of that hardware, probably left by somebody passing through years back. The loop had sprung and been twisted into a loose spiral, tucked under a rock with the stake pulled and laid beside it. Not tossed, set aside. I crouched in wet grass and turned the wire over in my hands. Heavy gauge, hard to twist bare-handed without tools. I looked for tracks and found only churned mud from rain and the split hoof marks of deer. I carried the wire to the shed and hung it on a nail by the workbench, then wrote the location in my Ridge Notes folder before I forgot. Luke wandered in while I was typing and squinted at the screen. "Is that detective stuff?" "Sort of," he grinned. "Can I be your assistant?" "You're already lead inspector." He looked proud enough to stand taller, then asked, "Should we leave another thank you?" I thought about that longer than needed. "What do you have in mind?" He went to the porch rail where a few late wildflowers had come up in the cracks, picked 3 purple asters and 1 crooked daisy, and set them in an old jelly jar with water. We carried it to the north fence at dusk and placed it on the flat stump beside the fir stand. Luke adjusted the stems twice until they sat respectful, his word. Boone sniffed the jar, sneezed, and settled at our feet. I felt ridiculous and sincere at the same time, a combination I hadn't known could coexist. "Appreciate the help," I said quietly toward the trees. Luke added, "And thanks for the wood. It made good fire." We walked back before full dark. When I looked over my shoulder from the porch, the jar was a small, pale shape near the trunks, catching the last light. The storm that carried the first clear glimpse came in on a Thursday evening thick as wet wool. I remember because we'd driven to town for feed and a refill on Luke's inhaler, and the pharmacist had warned me to top off batteries. The sky on the way home had that green-grey cast that makes every hill look flatter than it is. By 6, drizzle stitched across the pasture. By 7, fog started climbing out of the hollows. I had agreed to watch Roy Abernathy's cow-calf pair for 3 days, while he took his sister to a specialist 2 counties over. Their pasture shared our lower fence, and the storm had pushed the calf toward the washout by the old culvert. I could see the mother pacing and hear that low, steady call cows make when they're trying not to panic. I grabbed my rain shell and told Luke to stay on the porch with Boone, where I could keep eyes on him. "I'm just going to the lower line," I said. Luke held up the big flashlight with both hands. "You want this? Keep it for me. If I wave, shine this way." He nodded, jaw set in that serious little square it got when he was scared but cooperating. I cut across the yard, boots sinking, and the drizzle thickened to a cold mist that blurred distance. The calf had one hind leg down in soft rut clay, near the culvert edge, not broken, just stuck and trembling. The mother stood 5 yards off, head low, blowing hard through her nose. I slowed, palms out, talking low so I wouldn't crowd either of them. "Easy, girl. Easy now." Then the woods to my left opened in motion. Not fast, not crashing. A tall, dark shape stepped between 2 firs with a control that made my own movement feel clumsy by comparison. 8 feet at least, maybe more, broad through shoulder and chest, fur dark with rain, water running off in narrow lines. It paused in full view at the fence break, turned its head toward me and held there. I froze. My body went rigid first, mind catching up second. Every label I'd ever used, bear, trick of light, tired eyes, fell apart in one quiet second because bears do not stand like that. And no man in a suit moves with that kind of balanced weight in mud. The figure didn't advance. It waited, not challenge, not threat, waiting for me to decide. I heard Luke's flashlight click on behind me from the porch, a pale beam cutting rain. Boone gave one short bark, then stopped. I took one step back from the calf, making room. The figure moved forward at an angle that gave the mother cow space to hold line without feeling cornered. It lowered into a crouch beside the trapped leg, with a care so measured it looked practiced. One large hand bracing in mud, the other clearing clay away in scoops. The calf jerked once. The figure paused immediately, still as a post, until the animal settled, then tried again, slower, easing the hoof free with a gentle pull and lift. No forceful yank, no struggle, just patient leverage. When the leg came clear, the calf stumbled upright and pressed against its mother. The cow swung her head, snorted, then backed with the calf toward higher ground. The figure stayed crouched, hands open and low, watching until they were clear. Only then did it rise. Lightning flashed far off, enough to silver the rain for half a second. In that light I saw the face plain, heavy brow, broad nose, mouth relaxed, eyes amber brown and steady. Not blank, not wild. A calm I felt in my own ribs before I understood it. I wanted to run, and I wanted to stay. I told myself this couldn't be real, that stress and weather and grief had finally crossed wires in my head. And at the same time, another part of me knew, with a certainty deeper than argument, that I was looking at a living thing, choosing gentleness, while being strong enough to choose anything else. The figure stepped backward, one pace, then another, giving the pasture back to us. It glanced past me toward the porch where Luke stood under the light, with Boone pressed against his knee. It didn't move closer. It only stood in rain at the edge of the firs, watchful and unhurried, until I nodded without planning to. "Thank you," I said, voice rough in my throat. It held my gaze one more beat, then turned sideways through the trees, and was gone so quietly the rains sounded loud again. I stood there a long moment with mud up my boots and my pulse pounding in my ears. The calf was safe on high ground. The mother had stopped calling. Behind me, Luke yelled, "Dad!" And I turned and raised my hand so he could see I was okay. On the walk back up, I looked once over my shoulder and caught a single wide footprint, filling with rain at the culvert edge, clear as any mark I'd ever logged on a job site. And for the first time since we moved to that ridge, curiosity outweighed grief all the way to the porch. Luke was already halfway down the porch steps when I came through the rain, flashlight beam wobbling across my knees because his hands were shaking. "Dad, are you hurt?" "I'm fine." I took the light and set it on the rail so it shone up into the rain instead of in our faces. "Calf's fine too." He searched my eyes, then looked past me toward the lower pasture. "What was that?" Boone leaned against Luke's leg, calm as Sunday. I put one hand on Luke's shoulder and felt the tightness there, the held breath. "Something big," I said. "Something careful." "Like a bear?" "No." The word came out before I had a better one to replace it. "Not like that." Luke swallowed. "Did it see me?" "Yeah." I kept my voice steady because he deserved steady. "It saw you. It didn't come near. It helped the calf and moved off." He nodded once, eyes still fixed on the dark line of trees. Boone wasn't scared. "Nope." That answer seemed to settle him more than anything else I could have offered. He pressed his palm into Boone's neck, then looked up at me again with that serious expression he wore when he was trying to be brave, on purpose. "Can we leave another thank you tomorrow?" "Yeah," I said. "We can do that." Inside, I stripped off wet layers in the mudroom and stood for a minute with my hands braced on the workbench, rain ticking off my jacket onto concrete. My pulse was still running hard. My mind kept replaying the same 3 seconds. Crouched in mud, one hand clearing clay from the calf's leg, pausing when the animal flinched, trying again softer. I had spent years around men who called themselves tough, and I had never seen that kind of strength paired with that kind of restraint. I told myself this couldn't be real. I said it in present tense in my own head like a command. I am tired. I am wet. I am primed for patterns because grief does that to a man. I am making a story where there's only weather and stress and bad light. Then another part of me answered, just as plain, I saw what I saw. I knew somehow that I wasn't in danger. That was the fact I couldn't file under error. After Luke was asleep, I opened Ridge Notes and added a new entry with fingers that still didn't feel fully mine. 7:18 p.m. Drizzle/fog, lower culvert pasture, visual contact at approximately 40 yards, height estimate 8+ feet, dark fur, bipedal movement, observed freeing trapped calf with deliberate care, no aggressive behavior, withdrew to tree line. I attached 2 photos I'd taken on the way back, one of the broad print at the washout edge and one of the calf tracks leading to high ground beside the mother's. Then I stared at the screen until it dimmed itself. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those amber-brown eyes in the lightning flash. Not wild, not vacant, not human either. Present, attentive. A primary consideration kept pressing at me. It had not only tolerated me, it had worked around me. It had given me space to choose. The resulting tension in my chest wasn't fear exactly. It was my old framework coming apart at the seams. By morning, the storm had broken into low cloud and pale sun. Luke ate eggs without being reminded and kept glancing out the kitchen window like dusk had moved to breakfast. We walked together to the lower pasture with Boone leading, Roy's cow-calf pair already settled near the high fence where the grass drained better. The calf limped a little, then straightened out after 20 yards. At the culvert edge, the wide print was still there in damp clay, softened at the edges but clear enough to measure. I set my tape beside it, while Luke held the notepad. 13.5 inches across, I said. Luke wrote carefully, tongue tucked at the corner of his mouth. That's bigger than your boot. By a lot. He looked at the print for a long moment, then at the woods. It didn't hide from you. That landed harder than he knew. No, I said, it didn't. On the drive to Roy's place before lunch, I expected disbelief and maybe a polite smile. Roy listened with both elbows on his tailgate, hat brim dripping from leftover mist, and didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he spat into the grass and gave that half-shrug mountain men use when they've decided not to argue with something older than they are. My granddad called it the ridge's old keeper, he said. Said you mind your business and mind what gets left for you. That's about all the rule book we got. You ever see it yourself? Roy rubbed his jaw, enough to stop calling folks liars. He glanced toward my truck, where Luke was drawing circles in fog on the passenger window with one finger. Boy, okay. Better than he was yesterday. Then keep doing whatever respectful looks like at your place, Roy said. And don't bring city game wardens into it unless you want trouble and jokes both. I laughed once, no humor in it. Wasn't planning to. That settled our external contact right there. No reports, no official channels, no spectacle. Just two men by a truck deciding what would and wouldn't help a kid sleep. 3 days passed before the next outage warning rolled over county radio. And by then, a small routine had taken shape that felt both strange and right. At dusk, Luke and I carried a simple offering to the flat stump near the fur stand. 2 apples one night, a pinch of tobacco wrapped in brown paper the next, wildflowers from the rail crack when the yard gave us any. We never lingered long. We set it down, said thank you in plain words, and walked back. Sometimes the offering was gone by morning. Sometimes it stayed 2 days and then disappeared after rain. Once, a braid of fresh grass appeared on the stump with no other sign around it, tighter and cleaner than any knot I could tie. Those evenings shifted Luke in ways I could measure without pretending. He still tensed when light dropped, but he started facing the windows instead of turning from them. He asked fewer what-if questions and more practical ones about clouds, wind direction, how to tell if rain would hold. By the second week of July, he had begun standing on the porch at twilight with Boone and calling out the first 3 stars when sky allowed, like he was taking attendance for the night. Then came a hard storm line at supper, the kind that turns daylight the color of tin. I had chili on low heat, Luke setting out bowls, Boone asleep under the table. Wind hit the west wall in a long shove. Lights blinked once, twice, out. Luke froze with a spoon in his hand, eyes wide, breath climbing fast. I got it, I said, already reaching for the headlamp by the door. You and Boone stay at the mudroom threshold where you can see me. Same drill. He nodded, but his lower lip trembled. Don't be long. I won't. Rain came heavy and slanting the second I stepped off the porch. My lamp beam caught the stone marker at the north path, then the next one, then the next, each pale face angled toward the firm route to the shed. I followed them at a half run. At the low spot where runoff usually turned to slick clay, someone had laid 3 flat slabs side by side since my last check, making a dry bridge above the wash. Not scrap lumber this time, stone, stable as poured concrete. I reached the generator lean-to and stopped short. A fresh limb thicker than my thigh lay in the yard 10 feet away, stripped of smaller branches and set parallel to the fence as neat as stacked timber. It should have been across my path based on the broken stub above. Instead, the way was clear. Under the shed overhang, protected from rain, sat a bundle of cedar bark and split kindling tied in braided grass. I didn't stand there long enough to argue with evidence. Choke set, fuel valve open, 2 pulls, then 3. Engine caught and settled into that rough, reassuring thrum that sounds like stability itself when you have a scared child in a dark house. I switched transfer, and porch lights came up warm across wet boards. Through the rain I saw Luke in the mudroom doorway, one hand on Boone's collar, shoulders dropping as the bulb steadied. On my way back, I lifted the cedar bundle and held it against my chest under my jacket. Halfway up the path, Boone trotted out to meet me, then stopped and looked past my shoulder toward the fir stand. I turned. At the tree line, maybe 40 yards off, the tall shape stood in rain shadow between trunks. No dramatic entrance, no attempt to loom. Just there, shoulders broad, head slightly inclined as if checking whether the lights held and the house was settled. I could make out the glint of eyes catching porch spill, calm and fixed on us. Luke stepped one pace onto the porch behind Boone, not far, just enough to see. I raised my free hand. "Thank you," I called over the rain. The figure remained still for a heartbeat, then took 2 backward steps into darker trees and disappeared without a sound I could track. Inside, I set the cedar by the stove and toweled off while Luke watched every motion like he was matching his breathing to mine. He touched the grass tie with one finger. "It brought that?" "Looks that way." "For us?" I nodded. "For us." He stood quiet, then said in that plain kid voice that cut straight to center, "I thought dark was empty. It's not empty." That was the payoff to every meaningful look he'd been giving the tree line for weeks, and hearing him name it made my throat tighten. "No," I said, "not empty." We lit the stove with the cedar bark, and the flame took quick and bright, casting steady gold across the kitchen walls. Luke sat on the floor with Boone, knees pulled up, watching firelight instead of shadows. I could feel my own breathing finally easing into a normal rhythm, not because I had solved the ridge, but because I had witnessed a pattern too consistent to dismiss. Markers where footing failed, kindling where rain made fire hard, distance kept on purpose, help given where it mattered most. Later, after Luke was asleep with his door mostly open and Boone stretched across the threshold on guard, I carried 1 apple and a small plug of tobacco to the stump by the firs. Rain had softened to a mist that made the porch light halo wide. I set the offering down and noticed, beside the stump, 3 smooth stones arranged in a shallow arc facing the house. Not random placement, a line of sight. Watch position. I didn't move them. I didn't pretend not to understand what they implied. Distinctive details matter when they repeat, and this one repeated clear as any field note. Whatever shared that ridge with us had chosen, again and again, to keep us safe without asking for approach, credit, or trust beyond what we could offer. "Mind what gets left for you," I said quietly, hearing Roy's words come back with more weight now. Then I added, "We will." When I walked back up to the porch, the dark beyond the rail looked deep as ever, but it no longer read as absence. It read as company held at a respectful distance, and for the first time since we buried Luke's mom, I stepped inside feeling less alone than the number of people in that house should have allowed. I stood in the mudroom a moment longer with my hand on the latch, listening to rain tick off the gutters and the softer house sounds behind me. Boone shifting on the hallway runner, Luke turning 1 page of a comic he was pretending to read instead of sleep. My shirt was still damp at the collar, still damp at. My chest felt light and tight at the same time, like relief had shown up carrying weight of its own. I hung my jacket, set my boots on the tray, and walked down the hall. Luke was propped against his headboard with the blanket bunched around his waist and a flashlight across his lap. Beam off, fingers hooked around it like a handle he wasn't ready to set down. Boone lifted his head when I stopped at the door, gave me one long look, and put his chin back on his paws. "You okay?" I asked. Luke nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again. "Kind of all of it." "That tracks." He studied me in the dim lamp glow. "Did it look at you the same way it looked at me?" I leaned against the doorframe. "Yeah, calm, like it was checking on us, not sizing us up." He picked at a loose thread on the blanket. "I keep waiting to feel scared again." "You might. Feelings loop back sometimes. He considered that, serious as ever. If I do, can I still come stand on the porch? Every time. He patted Boone's shoulder once and slid lower under the blanket. Can the door be mostly open? Already the plan. By the time his breathing evened out, the rain had changed pitch. It got heavier in pulses, wind-driven, the kind that hits one side of the house and then swings. I made one more circuit, because routine still steadied me. Stove draft, window latches, lantern fuel, generator keys on the hook. When I stepped into the kitchen, lightning flashed far enough away to be silent, just white light through the sink window, and the black shape of furs beyond it. I poured half a mug of coffee, forgot to drink it, and stood at the counter with both palms flat on worn laminate. Just after midnight, thunder arrived close enough to rattle the glassware in the cabinet. Boone came up from the hall and stood with his shoulder against my knee. 10 seconds later, the power dropped hard. No flicker first, just full dark, and the refrigerator winding down like a held breath letting go. Luke shouted from his room, high and thin. "Dad?" "I'm here," I called, already grabbing the headlamp. "Same drill, mudroom threshold." Wind hit the west wall with a sound like a truck passing too close. Another lightning flash lit the yard and showed me, clear as day for one split second, a fresh pine laid across the generator, lean-to roof. Not a branch. A whole young tree, uprooted and thrown by wind. My stomach dropped. Luke reached the mudroom before I got there, blanket around his shoulders, flashlight shaking in both hands. Boone pressed against his leg, steady, warm, exactly where he needed to be. "It's okay," I said, kneeling so we were eye level. "Listen to me. You stay right here under the overhang. Do not step into the yard. You keep Boone's collar. You keep your light on me. I'm going to clear the shed and start the generator." His breath was quick, shoulders up near his ears. "What if you can't? Then we use lanterns and blankets and we're still safe. What if?" I put my hand on the flashlight and lowered it gently so the beam settled. "One job, Luke. Light on me." He swallowed hard. "One job." I ran into rain so heavy it stung my face. The path stones held under my boots, water sheeting around them. By the time I reached the shed, I knew what my back already suspected from that lightning flash. The pine trunk had come down across the lean-to roofline at an angle, pinning the door frame and pressing one side inward near the fuel can shelf. I shoved once. Nothing. I tried leverage with a fence post. Barely any give. Wind shoved rain down my neck. Behind me, Luke's flashlight beam swung wide, then found me again. For a second, standing there soaked and breathing hard in the dark, every held thing in me pressed forward at once. I was tired in my bones from weeks of bracing. Tired of being the only wall between my son and what scared him. Tired of answering questions I couldn't fix with tools. Tired of missing my wife at 1 in the afternoon and 1 in the morning with the same force. I set both hands on the jammed shed door and felt that old helplessness rise, the one I'd been covering in checklists and repair jobs and useful noise. Another flash, this one closer. In that white-blue light, the tree line moved. He stepped out from the firs into rain with the same deliberate pace I had seen at the culvert, huge and dark against the blown grass, water running off his shoulders in narrow streams. He did not come straight at me. He angled wide, leaving a clear lane between me and the house. He stopped 2 long strides from the fallen pine and looked from the trunk to me, then toward the mudroom where Luke stood, frozen in the doorway. I raised one hand without thinking, palm open. "Need this off the shed," I said, voice rough from rain and adrenaline. He shifted his weight and bent, both hands finding purchase under the wet trunk. The scale of him should have made the moment feel unreal, but what fixed me in place was the care. He lifted slow, testing load first, then raised the pine just enough to clear pressure from the frame. He stepped sideways, not back, so the trunk never swung toward fuel cans. He set it down in the yard with controlled force, cushioned, no splintering crack, no wild movement. Then he straightened and took 2 backward steps, exactly as before, giving me the workspace. I didn't waste the opening. Door free, fuel valve, choke, pull 1, pull 2, engine coughed, pull 3, and it caught. Transfer switch over. Porch lights bloomed gold through rain. The whole yard changed colour in an instant, from storm black to warm, wet amber. When I turned, he was crouched near the porch overhang, placing a bundle of bone-dry cedar bark and kindling where Splash couldn't reach. He used his fingertips like a man setting down eggs. Then he rose and withdrew to the edge of the light, waiting, not leaving yet, as if making sure we had what we needed before he took himself back into trees. I walked halfway between shed and porch, rain still coming hard, and for once, I didn't try to make sense of it before speaking. "Thank you," I said, loud enough to carry. Luke stepped onto the wet boards behind me, blanket gone now, flashlight still in his hand but lowered at his side. He was shaking, but he kept walking until he was beside my elbow. Boone came with him, water beading on his grey muzzle, tail low and easy. Luke looked out at the tall shape in the rain, and then up at me. His voice was small and steady at once. "Can I turn this off?" I glanced at the flashlight and nodded. "Your call, buddy." He clicked it off. Porch light and lightning held the yard. He took 1 slow breath, then another, and said, plain as a weather report, "I'm not scared now." That sentence opened something in me I had been holding shut since the hospital parking lot, since paperwork and casseroles and being told to stay strong by people who meant well. I put a hand on the porch post to steady myself and felt my face fold before I could stop it. I cried right there in rain and porch light with my son at my side. Not quiet tears I could hide with a turned shoulder, but full body, shaking relief that hurt and healed in the same breath. Luke leaned into me without hesitation, arms around my middle, cheek against my soaked shirt. "It's okay, Dad," he said into the fabric. "It's okay." I got one laugh out through the tears, raw and surprised. Yeah, I think it is." Across the yard he stood still as stone, watching us with that same calm, amber-brown gaze. No triumph in it, no demand, just presence. By the time thunder rolled farther east, the rain had eased from sheets to steady fall. He turned first at the shoulders, then at the hips, and stepped backward once from the edge of the porch light. He paused there, half in shadow, and I had the clear sense he was giving us a final look the way a neighbour might check a gate after helping close it. Then he faced the trees and moved into them without ceremony, each step quiet despite the wet ground, dark shape thinning between trunks, until there was only rain and fur and the pale run of mist along the ridge. I did not follow. I did not call out again. Some gifts stay whole because you let them end where they end. Luke and I stood on the boards until the chill reached our sleeves. At the yard edge, wide tracks filled slowly with rainwater, each one holding a brief mirror of porch light before the surface blurred. I took a photo because habit is habit, then put the phone away and left the rest untouched. Inside, I toweled Luke's hair while he sat on the closed toilet lid in the mudroom, Boone wedged against his knees like a warm sandbag. I changed him into dry pajamas, wrapped him in his old green blanket, and set the cedar bundle by the stove. He watched me split 2 strips and lay them on coals. Flame caught quick and clean, soft gold filling the kitchen. From his chair at the table, Luke looked at the dark window over the sink and then back to the fire. "It still gets dark," he said. "Yep. But it doesn't feel mean. I sat across from him, hands around a mug of reheated coffee gone thin, and let that settle through me. "No," I said. "It doesn't." He yawned hard enough to make Boone lift his head. "Can door be mostly open again?" "Every night you want." I got him back to bed. He was asleep before I reached the hallway. Boone took his post at the threshold with a groan and a circle, and then stillness. I returned to the kitchen, opened Ridge Notes, and logged only what mattered. Time of outage, pine on lean-to, generator restored, cedar bundle placed under overhang, visual contact at close range, no threat behavior, deliberate assistance. Then I added one line I had never written in any report in my life. My son turned off his own flashlight. I closed the phone, banked the stove, and stood at the back window a long while watching rains soften the yard into silver and shadow. The dark beyond the porch light was deep as ever, but it held no emptiness now, only distance, trees, and a kindness that asked nothing except respect. I stayed at that window until the rain thinned to a mist, and the generator settled into a steady hum that sounded almost like breathing. When I finally turned in, the hallway nightlight was enough. I did not need the flashlight in my hand, so I left it on the kitchen counter and went to bed empty-handed for the first time in months. At 6, Luke padded into my room in sock feet and tapped my shoulder once. "Dad?" I came up fast from light sleep. "Yeah?" He pointed toward the hall. "Power's still on," I checked. There was pride in it, not panic. I sat up and listened, fridge running, stove ticking as last night's heat faded, Boone's nails on the floorboards as he repositioned outside Luke's door. Ordinary sounds. I nodded. "Good check." Luke hesitated, then asked, "Can we look at the yard?" We pulled on jackets and stepped onto wet porch boards silvered by early light. The fallen pine lay where it had been set, parallel to the fence, cleanly out of the path. No splintered fuel line, no crushed shed roof. Just a solved problem sitting in plain view. Luke walked down one step, Boone close to his knee, and studied the ground with the seriousness of a surveyor. "Tracks are still here," he said. They were. Wide impressions softened by rain but readable, leading from tree line to shed, then to the porch overhang, then back toward the firs. I took photos from 3 angles, then knelt and showed Luke how to include scale with a tape measure. "Why do you always do that part?" he asked. "So memory doesn't do all the work," I said. "Memory changes shape. Measurements usually don't." He nodded and wrote the time in my notepad without being asked. After breakfast, I moved every physical piece we'd collected into one place. The twisted snare wire from the shed nail, one grass tie that had dried intact, printed photos from the porch printer in town, and a flash drive copy of Ridge Notes. I put them in my old metal Line Crew lockbox, latched it, and slid it onto the top shelf in the hall closet. Kept, labelled, not hidden from myself, and not offered up to people looking for a joke. That afternoon, Roy came by to collect his cow-calf pair. He stood in the yard with his hands on his hips, looking from the moved pine to the generator, lean-to me. He gave me a long look, the kind that asks for honesty without demanding it. "You get through all right," he said. "We did," I answered. "Had help again." He exhaled through his nose and tipped his hat back. "Grandad used to leave tobacco by a cedar stump each first storm. Said the ridge remembered courtesy longer than people did." I waited because it felt like there was more. Roy scratched his jaw and glanced toward Luke, who was coiling hose by the steps. "You asked if I saw it. Truth is, once when I was 16, our milk cow got hung in wire by the creek. By the time I reached her, wire was off and laid in a spiral. Same as you found. I told my father. He said, 'Then say thanks and quit bragging.' He looked back at me. That's all I know. Never tried to know more. That paid off every half-sentence he'd been carrying. We loaded his calf, checked latches, and he drove out with 2 fingers raised off the wheel. No ceremony. 3 days passed before I had to go to town, and Luke came with me for feed, batteries, and a replacement gasket for the canner. At Miller's Feed, the cashier, who used to make careful small talk, watched Luke stack 2 40-pound bags on the cart and smiled. "He looks taller," she said. "He sleeps better," I replied. At the pharmacy, the same woman who used to hold my gaze too long scanned Luke's refill, then leaned on the counter and asked him directly, "How are nights up on that ridge now?" Luke did not glance at me for an answer. "Better," he said. "I still don't like thunder, but I can stand on the porch." She nodded like that made complete sense. That's good progress. No one pressed for details. No one asked me to prove anything. The politely doubtful stayed politely doubtful, and I learned to be grateful for that boundary. By the second week of August, our evenings had a shape I could trust. Supper, dishes, porch for star count, then a short walk to the north stump with whatever we had to spare. Apples, a pinch of tobacco, late asters in a jelly jar when Luke found them. One night, we found the jar moved 6 feet uphill under thicker cover before rain. Another evening, the offerings were untouched, but 3 smooth stones sat in a gentle arc, facing the house. Same watchline as before. I stopped treating those details like puzzles and started treating them like communication in a shared framework. Distance, respect, care. Luke's change was visible in his body before it was audible in his words. His shoulders no longer rose to his ears at dusk. He stopped gripping door frames when clouds built. One evening a storm rolled over and the lights blinked twice, but held. He clicked on his flashlight out of habit, looked at it, then set it on the table and left it there. "You good?" I asked. He looked out the window where rain striped the glass. "Yeah, I just like knowing where it is." "Fair." He gave me a small grin. "That's what you always say when you agree." I laughed and took the ribbing because he was right. Near the end of August, I had one more external loose end to close. A former crew buddy from the utility company called and offered me storm contract weeks back online repair. Good money, long hours, mostly nights. Old me would have said yes in one breath. I stood by the sink with the phone pressed to my ear while Luke and Boone played checkers at the table. "You still there?" my buddy asked. "I am," I said. "You in or out?" I looked at my son, chin in his hand, plotting a move like his life depended on red pieces reaching the far row. "Out for now," I told him. "Need to be home evenings." He whistled low. "Didn't think you'd ever turn that down." "Didn't either," I said, and meant it. By the first cool week of October, I had rebuilt the lean-to roofline, reset 2 fence runs, and rehung the mudroom door square so it stopped sticking in damp weather. Luke painted the lower rails with me in a jacket 2 sizes too big, and Boone supervised from a blanket in the sun like a retired foreman who still expected standards. We finished before dusk and sat on the porch wrapped in work smell, paint and pine and cold air. Luke nudged my arm. "Can we turn the porch light off tonight?" I looked at him to make sure I heard right. "You sure?" "Yeah, I want to see the stars better." I reached behind us and clicked it off. Dark settled over the yard in layers. Not empty, just deep. Tree line, pasture, ridge shoulder, sky. Luke leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and started naming constellations he knew and inventing names for the ones he didn't. Boone's breathing was slow and even between us. After a while, Luke said, "I still miss Mom most at night." "Me too." He was quiet, then added, "It doesn't hurt like getting cut now, more like carrying a heavy backpack." I swallowed hard and nodded into the dark. That's about right. He tipped his head against my shoulder. I can carry it. I know you can. That was the sentence I had needed to hear, and maybe the sentence he had needed to say. The last time I saw him that season was not dramatic. It was early November, clear and cold after first frost. I stepped out before sunrise to cover the pump and found a fresh bundle of dry cedar set under the porch overhang, tied in clean braided grass. No tracks stayed in the hard ground long enough to read. I took one photo, then set the bundle by the stove and left 2 apples and tobacco at the stump after breakfast. When I came back, the eastern sky was turning gold through the firs, and for a moment I caught a tall, dark shape far up the tree line, standing still in that first light. He did not approach. I did not call out. I placed my hand over my heart, a gesture that felt old and true, and he turned and went on with his morning. Luke is older now, long-legged and loud in the kitchen, and he walks to the barn at dusk without asking for a light unless he needs one for work. He still keeps a flashlight by his bed. So do I. Tools are not fear, they are readiness. What changed was the meaning of dark in this house. Dark used to mean we were alone with what hurt. On that ridge, it came to mean we were held in a wider company than I had language for, one that asked us to be decent, observant, and grateful. The lockbox is still on the closet shelf. I open it some winters and lay the evidence out on the table. Photo prints with measurements, one dry grass tie, the twisted snare wire, notes in my own block handwriting. I look at each item and feel the same grounded certainty I felt in rain by the shed. The world stayed mysterious. It stopped feeling cruel. I couldn't fix grief with tools, but I learned I could live beside it without letting it teach my son that night was a thing to fear. On that ridge, the dark became a place where kindness could stand just beyond the porch light, keep its distance, and still keep watch.